Let's start from the fundamentals. When policymakers and market participants talk about carbon price, so what all instruments and mechanism does that umbrella covers?
Okay. Thanks, Dakshita, for the question. To answer that, let's understand what carbon price is. So, carbon price is the cost we pay for the greenhouse gas emissions. So, the companies, they internalize the external cost of carbon, which can be seen as price per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, generally, it is required for the companies who consume carbon intensive, products, or the processes are carbon intensive. This helps them to align with the social cost of their activities. And there are three mechanisms which are there as far as carbon pricing is concerned. The first one is emission trading system, ETS, and we also call it as cap and trade system. And as the name suggests, generally the covered entities are, there is a cap which is set on the emission intensity. Targets are given to these companies, and within there is a compliance period which is there, and these companies are allowed to surrender certain allowances or permit if they exceed exceed beyond emission targets. So this is how when you look at emission cap and trade, and to set the cap, either you calculate the amount of GHG emissions, or you set up an intensity as a cap. So when we look at intensity as a cap, that can be emissions per output for that company. The second one which we see is carbon tax. And in carbon tax, it's generally the government levies a fee on the covered entities. And generally, it's a carbon tax which can be decided either on the emissions, or it can be on the carbon content on the fuel. So these are the two things in which you can set up a tax rate. Third, which we see are carbon credit mechanisms which have been there. And the carbon credit mechanisms, these are generally the tradable credits which are generated through the voluntary activities which the company is supposed to do to reduce their emissions. When we look at the total global scenario, there are currently around 80 policy instruments in this space, where majority are the ETS. 47, I think, roughly comes as emission trading mechanism, and there are around 33 or 30 some around in the cap and trade mechanism.
So, what carbon pricing attributes give confidence to buyers, developers, and investors?
Okay. Yes, a very important question indeed. I would say there are 5 broader attributes which we will talk about. The first is environmental integrity. Now, when we look at environmental integrity, buyers and developers must have trust around the carbon, credits which are generated, leading to a permanent reduction. That is why there has to be, third party, verifications have to be there. The registries have to be transparent. Market liquidity and price predictability is very important in this space. They need to have, consistent demand has to be there. There has to be price stability also, which is very important. So if you look at, there are certain mechanisms where we talk from an auction reserve price or a price floor, perspective. There has to be a regulatory and support and international alignment of the carbon credits which you're generating. So the regulatory support is very important. So if you look at currently in India, we have CCTS mechanism, and there has to be an international linkages of the domestic market. That becomes very important. And after Article 6, mechanisms have to be also integrated, properly. Especially after COP26, we see, in India, the market is maturing, the market is evolving fast. So the international linkages become very important. For example, where you look at ITMO, which has to be connected with whatever domestic market schemes you're having. Look at fourth, it would be, co-benefits and SDG alignment should be there. MRV system in place, that is, I think, one of the most important factors.
In which period, historically, carbon market was most supportive, and what were the key drivers for that support?
So when we look at this whole, carbon market ecosystem, I feel it all, let's look at the history of it. If you look at the first, the carbon tax was adopted by Finland in 1990, and there were countries like US and Britain which followed. But the real impact, or when we look at from the support which came, was from Kyoto Protocol. And that too specifically between 2002 to 2015 is what we see a lot of work which has happened. During Kyoto Protocol and through your CDM, development mechanisms, mandated that, in the industrialized economies, developed economies, they were given certain emission reduction target, and the clean development mechanism allowed them to invest in the developing economies, to meet their, to invest in the emission reduction projects in development economies, to meet their targets. So this is how the whole space evolved, during Kyoto Protocol. There was very low transaction cost, which facilitated your CDMs. And India was one of the biggest beneficiaries of CDM. Second is still happening now, and it was post Paris Agreement after 2015. And if you look at more precisely after COP26, where the Article 6 mechanisms came, and this evolved further, where different kinds of mechanisms came in. Indian perspective, central government, they in fact amended our Energy Protection Act 2001 was amended in 2022. This amendment then, basically gave a structure to our Indian carbon markets, under which we had a proper framework. The CCTS framework of carbon credit, trading systems came in place, and this is in 2023, which happened. And in December again, the offset mechanism was also included in our, CCTS scheme. So this is how, when we look at it from a history part, right from Kyoto to Paris, and now we see this Indian space moving. If you look at the key drivers of this market, I think 140 countries have taken their net zero commitment. We see suddenly for past 2-3 years, ESG performance and ESG scoring has come into spotlight. And all your investment decisions are being done around ESG. We see European market evolving, where you have the CBAM. So all these are very critical key drivers.
How do fossil fuel subsidies and environmental penalties influence carbon pricing and its overall effectiveness?
They are both sides of the same coin, but they cancel out each other. We need to strike a right balance. If you look at fossil fuel subsidies globally, it is going in trillions of dollars. And if on the other hand, if you look at the carbon pricing, the revenue generated through carbon pricing, I think in 2024, the revenue what we generated was $100 billion. So you see, as compared to the fossil fuel subsidies, $100 billion, where you are having, say, fossil fuel subsidies of $7 trillion or so. From a policy perspective, it's very fragmented.
So are you convinced that carbon pricing will shape tomorrow's profit and loss statements, or have a defining role in shaping the carbon price?
Yes, definitely. I think absolutely, there's no doubt about it. It is already impacting, when you look at the carbon cost of it, and its alignment with the social cost of the activities. Carbon pricing, we shift from the society to the emitters. Regulations currently, as I mentioned, from a ESG perspective, or if you look at CBAM, or if you look at IFRS S2, IFRS S1, where it is very important for your company to account for the carbon cost in your your direct cost, indirect cost, and even your value chain emissions. Counting becomes very important. So for your scope 3 emissions become very important, else your risk to your company goes really high. Your funding opportunity gets reduced. There's a reputation risk which comes, apart from the transition risk, if you don't align with the transition risk. So definitely I see that it impacting the top line and the bottom line as well. A perspective, RBI came with the climate risk draft last year. So I think the banks are also mandated to calculate their financed emissions. Maybe not right now, but maybe in the future, your risk accounting will impact the stress testing, how the bankers consider your portfolio, so that the loans and the investments would also vary looking at the from an emission perspective. Plus also there's a long way to go as far as development is concerned.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time and your expertise.
Thank you, and it was wonderful being here.